So the American Revolution ended in 1783, and the 13 colonies, now states, became independent. But the United States as a whole didn't really exist yet. All of these states were basically like independent countries. You can think of the government that they had, the sort of loose national government, which was called the Continental Congress, as being almost like the EU or something. It has some power, but it's basically an association between sovereign, independent nations. New Jersey is basically a country. South Carolina is basically a country. They're the ones that have the power to, for instance, decide what kind of taxes they want to have, what kind of monetary system they want to have, printing their own money even. They're the ones who have the right to raise a military. All the Continental Congress really does is deal with foreign powers, deal with treaties and so on and so forth. So how did we end up moving from this to a much stronger central government? Now, what you'll often hear is, the Articles of Confederation, which is that original kind of constitution that organizes this very loose federation of independent states. You'll hear, that didn't work that well. We had to get rid of it because it didn't work well. Well, to that I ask, it didn't work well for who? And it didn't work well for what? Because there were actually some people who definitely would have preferred to keep it. And it's actually not that hard to identify who the people were who wanted a constitution and who the people were who didn't necessarily want a constitution. And the fact is that these were groups of people who had different sets of interests. So to illustrate what I mean by that, and to tell you about one of the events that really pushed America towards the adoption of a constitution, I'm going to tell you about this event called Shays' Rebellion. It takes place in Western Massachusetts. And basically, to put it in the simplest terms, this is an uprising of poor farmers on the frontier in the western part of the state against the wealthier population that has a dominant position in the government and that inhabits the coast of Massachusetts, especially Boston. And they want a lot of changes, but what they basically want is to change the tax policy and to change the monetary policy of the state in a way that is going to be beneficial for the poor. So they want to cut taxes, for one thing. Now, cutting taxes, we tend to think of that now as kind of like a conservative thing, but it's useful to understand the context here. So one of the reasons for high taxes is that the high taxes were being used to pay basically investors who had invested in bonds, who had invested in government bonds at the state level to finance the war. And they were being repaid with a lot of interest. So people who had made that investment were making a profit. And they were basically profiting off of these high taxes. So there was resentment by the poorer farmers inland that they were being taxed to make someone else a profit, right? And I want to explain also this issue of monetary policy a little bit. This could seem a little tricky, but it's really pretty simple. One of the things that a lot of the rebels in Western Massachusetts wanted was the printing of more paper money. Why would they want more paper money to be printed? Well, the basic reason for that is that if you take out a loan, right? If you take out a loan, which these farmers tended to be highly indebted, and then more money is printed, causing inflation, right? Causing the value of money to basically go down, then essentially your loan gets cheaper. That is, when you're a farmer and you're sort of selling your products, the price of those products is nominally going to be higher, right? We can think of this today. You understand how this happens, right? Like egg prices are really high because the buying power of money is lower, right? So the eggs get more expensive when we have a state of inflation. So if you were somebody who sold eggs, but you had also taken on a debt that debt isn't adjusted for inflation, right? It stays the same amount. If you borrowed $5, it's still $5. You still owe $5, but with the inflation, $5 is worth less, and so your income for the eggs that you sell is going to rise in proportion to that debt. So it makes it a lot easier to pay off your debts. If you can't follow that right now, or you're not particularly interested in that, that's okay. It's something I'm interested in. The thing to remember is printing more money would equal making it easier for poorer people to pay off their debts in the context of this period. And that is going to be important to remember. So one of the main things these rebels wanted was to try to force the government to print more money. They filed petitions to say that that should be done. And when those petitions weren't responded to, they took up arms. A lot of these people, remember, didn't necessarily have the right to vote, because the right to vote wasn't available to people who didn't meet certain property qualifications. So this event was put down pretty quickly, right? This rebellion did not succeed, but it raised a lot of concerns, particularly among wealthy elite colonists. Why did it concern them? They thought, well, okay, there's been this one revolution we all participated in, but some people might want to have another revolution, you know? They might want to have, there might be a revolution of the mob, of the poor masses, trying to redistribute wealth or something like that. And we can't have that. We've got to prevent that from happening. So how can we prevent that from happening? Well, there were two things that a lot of people who wanted a stronger national government thought that it would achieve. For one thing, if you have a national government that in which each state only sends a couple of representatives, a few representatives to that national government, think about how just that alone is going to make it harder to change policy, right? So if government is at the level of a state, if a state has sort of all the power over its own policy of taxation, its own monetary policy, and so on, it's not that hard to imagine that, okay, in a small state like New Jersey, maybe you could get enough people together who really wanted to change all this, and they could take over the government, and they could change all of these policies in ways that benefit the poor and maybe bankrupt the rich, right? But if you have each of these states is only, sending a couple of representatives to a national government, and then you're at a level where, okay, you would need to really have a kind of revolution like that happening in a whole bunch of these states. A whole bunch of these states would all have to agree to send representatives to the national government that wanted these kind of radical reforms in order for those reforms to happen. So it's harder to get radical stuff done in a big national government than in a smaller state government. And so in addition to creating the national government, they want to take these powers that the states have and put them in the national government where they think they'll be more secure. So the power to, the states end up retaining some powers to tax, but they want the federal government to also be able to impose certain taxes. And they definitely don't want each state to be able to decide how much money it's going to print or how it's going to deal with money. They want that to be in the national government, where, for the reason that I just explained, the idea is it's going to be harder to influence. So that's the kind of impulse behind the national government. The support for having a national government, for writing a constitution, is really concentrated among wealthier people who believe that that is going to be the best protection for their property rights. Okay? So now I've given this impression that the Constitution is just sort of a conspiracy of rich people who all agree with each other and want the same thing. It is sort of a conspiracy of rich people, but they don't all agree with each other and they don't all want the same thing. There are a number of divides at the Constitutional Convention. One thing that gets talked about a lot is this: there's a divide between the big states and the little states. There's this, this Virginia plan, which wants representation to be based on the population size of the state. And then there's this New Jersey plan, a smaller state, obviously, that wants the representation to all be equal. That ends up getting resolved with this compromise of what we have now, where you have a House, right, that is based on population, but everyone gets the same number of senators. But a more interesting controversy to me is this sort of controversy over slavery. There's a controversy over slavery. And this is important to understand because you will run into people today who will tell you, oh, everybody at the Constitution wanted slavery. They wanted to keep slavery. Everyone at the Constitutional Convention. Not true. Or maybe you'll have somebody who will say, well, the Constitution is fundamentally a document of freedom. It opposed slavery. Not true. It's both, okay? It's both because there was a disagreement among the different people at the Constitutional Convention over whether we should have slavery. A number of enslaved people in the wake of the American Revolution submitted these things to state legislatures that are called freedom petitions. And freedom petitions were these documents basically arguing that, now we've had a revolution, and now that this is a country consecrated to liberty, we can't have slavery anymore. And it might surprise you to learn that some legislatures actually really listen to this, right? Many people, many of the founding fathers were aware that there was something wrong with slavery in this time. Even people who owned a lot of slaves, like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, also thought that slavery should eventually be done away with. Keyword, eventually, right? It was a lot easier for people in the northern colonies to abolish slavery because in the North, they just weren't as economically dependent on slavery. In the North, even though there is a fair amount of slavery in some states like New York, Rhode Island, it's easier to get rid of it. It's easier to listen to this voice of conscience that says this isn't quite right. And so actually, several states, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, all of those states by the time of the Constitutional Convention had passed laws that would gradually end slavery in those states. So the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, which is, if I haven't made this clear, is a gathering of people from each of the states to hammer out a national system of government. The people from those states don't want a constitution that supports slavery, but people from the South aren't ready for that change yet. So you get a series of compromises in the Constitution that make it so the Constitution is somewhat pro-slavery and somewhat anti-slavery. There are a few examples of this I can give. One example would be the 3/5 compromise. It's sometimes sort of misleadingly summarized as that, like, the framers of the Constitution thought that slaves only should count as 3/5 of a human being. They weren't fully human. That's not what it is. It means that for the purposes of taxation and electoral representation, a slave should be counted as 3/5 of a citizen. And the reason for that is that slaves in the states that have a lot of them add substantially to that population. So that could mean two things. It could mean that state gets a lot of, extra representatives in the House because they have a big population, theoretically, even though those people aren't actually treated as citizens. But it could also mean their tax burden is high because they have this big population. So you get this debate over like the southern states, they want to have all of those slaves counted for purposes of representation so they can get a bigger representation, but they don't want them counted for purposes of taxation. And then there are people in the North who say, oh, we should tax them based on that, but don't let them get representation based on that. So there's this debate. You end up with the 3/5 compromise, which still is going to give southern states, particularly as slavery expands, certain advantages in terms of representation. That's going to become a big issue a little later on in the history of the country. There's this other pro-slavery element of the Constitution that's sometimes called the Fugitive Slave Clause. Even though it doesn't use the word slave, it requires that, quote, a person held to service or labor should be returned to their employer, no matter what state they fled to. So if they run from a state that has slavery to a state that doesn't, they still have to be returned. But it's useful to note the provision does not use the word slave. The word slave actually never appears in the Constitution, and that's a reflection of the fact that many delegates didn't like slavery, didn't think that the founding document of a country that is all about freedom should talk about slavery. They thought there was something shameful about that. And there are also provisions that are anti-slavery. Without explicitly using the word, it gives Congress the right to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. It gives Congress to ban slavery in parts of the country that hadn't yet been organized into states. So it's important to know that, like, there is a kind of class unity among the people who wanted a constitution, and the delegates at the constitution tended to be of the wealthier and more elite part of the states they came from. And there is a sense in which the Constitution is, and the Constitutional Convention is a sort of representation of ruling class interests. But which ruling class? We were starting to see the emergence of two different competing ruling classes in the country. Very important, right? One whose wealth is based on growing industry and trade and mercantile activities in the North, and one whose wealth is based on plantation slavery in the South. Okay, you can probably imagine how that is going to become more and more important as time goes on. Just give us a quick overview of what's the Constitution, what Constitution do we end up with, basic civic stuff. We have a national government that has a judicial, legislative, and executive branch. The purpose is to provide these checks and balances. Power is distributed among the different branches in such a way that it's difficult for one of them to wield absolute power. You have a House with representation based on population, a Senate, 2 senators for state, regardless of size. Both have to vote for a bill in order for it to be passed. The president can veto the bill, but that veto can be overridden with a 2/3 majority of both houses. And the Supreme Court, whose powers will get more defined over time, has the right to object to the legality of a law. Is it constitutional or not? And I should also add that having a president was not uncontroversial, because a president in executive is kind of like a king. So what remained was to get the voting populations of individual states to approve the new Constitution. And so there were propaganda campaigns both for and against the Constitution. We remember the propaganda for the Constitution a lot better. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. These are studied, these are talked about all the time, and you're going to read some of them. But there are also these anti-Federalist papers that almost nobody talks about today. And these were diverse criticisms of the idea of a constitution, and as you might expect, they generally seem to suggest that the Constitution was a tool in the hands of the wealthy, a tool in the hands of the elites of the various states. So in 1788, the Constitution is ratified, but it's ratified based on a promise to include certain provisions that are guarantees of rights, guarantees of where the new government is not going to be able to overstep the rights of citizens. Because one feature of the anti-federalist argument was that this government, won't it be tyrannical? Couldn't it become just like the British government, and giving so much power to this federal government, this president that's kind of like a king? How do we know that they're not going to reduce us all to some form of serfdom or subjugation? And so we get this Bill of Rights, and it's funny to note that things like freedom of speech, the right to a trial, protection against searches and seizures, those are things that we think of today as like the best elements of our Constitution. We're really proud of those. But those were almost like concessions to the people that actually didn't want a constitution. We really owe the anti-federalists, not the federalists, for those parts of our Constitution that a lot of us like the best now. So with the ratification of the Constitution, the American states become a nation with a government that has all the tools it needs to wield great power at home and ultimately abroad. Now, I just want to add an addendum here to mention that we can imagine a sort of alternative history in which the Constitution was never passed. And I'm not sure that that's in every way a worse history than the one we ended up with. Without the Constitution, we would have had on this continent basically, or on part of the continent, a collection of small nations, each with their own way of doing things, probably many of them much more open to certain radical and transformative reforms, and much more responsive to their electorate than the nation as a whole. And probably none with the kind of might and power to project force across the continent and abroad. Now, of course, as we'll learn, the Constitution was the mechanism for abolishing slavery, and the Articles of Confederation would not have had a clear path towards abolishing slavery if they were retained. But at the same time, the persistence and strengthening of slavery in the 19th century, as we'll see, had a lot to do with the kind of power that the federal government could flex, the power that it could use to acquire territory and expel Native Americans from that territory. And after the Civil War was over, federal power was going to be brought to bear in a really harsh way on Native Americans, as we'll see. So it would be a mistake, I think, to equate the Constitution with progress and to equate a strong federal government with equality and justice. It's worth considering this alternative perspective of what the trajectory of our country might have been without the Constitution. This isn't a viewpoint you're going to hear often these days, and this is probably the most opinionated that I'll get in any of these lectures, but it's just a small corrective to the overwhelming bias in favor of the Constitution and against the Articles of Confederation, and just something you might want to consider as a thought experiment. Thanks.